Are you attracted to bad boys, or even bad girls for that matter? Have you ever had a crush on a celebrity criminal, like Ted Bundy or the likes of Charles Manson? Maybe you ever tried to pursue a romantic relationship with a real-life inmate. If any of this sounds familiar, you may be experiencing Hybristophilia. Hybristophilia is a condition in which an individual is attracted to somebody who has committed heinous crimes, such as rape, kidnapping, or even murder. It's not officially recognized as a disorder within the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM-5. It is a topic that has been in recent controversy in the years, as individuals who experience hybristophilia has been on the rise. Not only am I somebody that is interested in forensic psychology and true crime, but I'm also someone with unregulated internet access, which, like many others, means I've seen some things on the internet which I haven't. You know what I'm talking about. These dark corners of the internet where people come together and form communities, and within these communities there's individuals that have icons that are of serial killers wearing flower crowns, and they have community boards where they discuss if it's really a disorder or if it's actually a sexuality, where they create fan fiction, fan art, and they create a video edit to the newest pop song with their favorite serial killer in it, almost like a K-pop stan edit, if you will. This entire phenomenon equally disgusted and intrigued me, and I ended up learning that, additionally, the hybristophilia is not a monolithic phenomenon. It has many facets, many causes, and many expressions. Some hybristophiles are attracted to just certain types of crime. Some only murderers, some only rapists. If that makes any sense to you, see it as blondes versus brunettes, if that makes it any easier. Some are attracted to the romanticized image of the bad boy or rebel that needs to be saved. Or they like the idea of the power dynamic with them being the criminal and them being the victim. There's even a percentage of people that are regarded as aggressive hybristophiliacs that want to commit crimes alongside of their criminal lover. And as you can imagine, this barrage of information got me going and had a never-ending string of questions come into my mind. How can someone be attracted to someone that is so fundamentally and obviously horrible? Is it psychological, societal? Is this paraphilia a result of true crime in the age of the internet? Let's talk about it. To start off, it's essential to understand the origins of hybristophilia. The name itself comes from the Greek word hybros, meaning behavior of violence, and philia, which means love or attraction. The term was first coined by John Moody, a sexologist in the 1950s, to describe a sexual attraction towards individuals who have committed crimes. However, cases of hybristophilia can be observed throughout history, even prior to the 1950s, with notorious criminals of the Wild West and the well-known Bonnie and Clyde, after whom the condition is often named Bonnie and Clyde syndrome. Since then, there have been numerous cases of hybristophilia being reported, where women are attracted to infamous killers such as Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Richard Ramirez, or those fanatics who are really into the Columbine killers and want to recreate it. As if you're noticing, a lot of this takes place with 70s killers, which we'll get back later too. However, it wasn't until the internet that hybristophilia gained much more attention, with the rise of true crime podcasts and online forums discussing the subject. Before, we just saw people sending letters to criminals trying to have this parasocial relationship with them, but now people can share interests online and continue to have it fed back with them, and they can grow communities around it. In academic papers of Karen Franklin, who has a PhD in forensic psychology, she points out that it's not as harmless as it may seem. It's not just a crush, if you will. It can have serious implications in the criminal justice system. These hybristophiliacs are often portrayed as harmless groupies, but if they decide to aid the criminals in any way, they can pose a real threat to public safety. And we've already seen that with aggressive hybristophiliacs. Recently, I had the pleasure of interviewing Byron Kaufman, a professor of psychology, where we discussed the psychological phenomenon behind hybristophilia. It is important to show beforehand that these lower basic paraphilias are harder to conduct empirical research on from a scientific perspective, not only due to stigmas, but not all disorders are considered paraphilic. Paraphilic
like disorders are a little harder to study, if I'm correct. They're harder to run research experiments on, I believe.
Yeah, it's hard because people usually aren't too distraught about them. Right.
Mhm.
So oftentimes people just think of it as a fetish, and if that's the way I find sexual satisfaction and it's not bothering anybody else, then who cares? Really, people only come to the attention of a clinician or a researcher if their sexual partner isn't really appreciative of whatever their paraphilia is. So people don't really, there's not a lot of treatment seeking if people can incorporate it easily into their lives.
Right, and it's not always considered a disorder if it is paraphilic. Uh,
Right. Hmm.
what
Yeah.
would make it considered a disorder?
Um, we consider anything a disorder where it causes distress to the person or anybody else. And what we mean by that is when it would become an issue is if you have a couple who are dedicated to one another and one person develops like a sexual sadism, paraphilia, and their partner is not into it and is distraught and doesn't want to participate. And, as long as someone's not a psychopath and forcing it upon them, they might become distraught themselves of like, why is this the new thing that can bring me to orgasm? Why can't I achieve satisfaction in different ways? So that's what I mean by distress of either the individual or somebody else. It's not just a judgment call of like, okay, this isn't typical, so I don't like it. Like there's a distress involved, or someone's a danger to themselves or somebody else, or if it ends up preoccupying so much time that people are not engaging other like value-driven behaviors.
It is typically assumed that trauma is the root cause, and yes, many hybristophiliacs do have trauma. It isn't the only cause. In our interview, she also gave me some great insight into misattribution of arousal. For those unfamiliar, misattributions of arousal is a psychological process where individuals mistake the source of their arousal.
So it's really interesting because people are always trying to find like biological markers that might tell us something about, what differentiates some people from another. And we're not even super successful in doing that with disorders that have a higher base rate, like schizophrenia or other type of psychotic disorders. Like the kind of biological markers don't really exist for most disorders. I'm sure they do. We just haven't discovered them. And a lot of the ones that we found aren't unique to a particular disorder. So I'm sure someone would likely endorse that there is, but I would be skeptical about that in terms of especially something as nuanced as different types of paraphilias. Why are you interested in a biological marker for something like this?
Because it is abnormal psychology, there is the question of why does somebody have this? I was going to follow up and ask you, because there's a whole nurture versus nature thing of is this something that is genetic or epigenetic, or is it the environment that they're in that can cause these kinds of things?
Yeah, probably all of the above. I think of it as from just a behavioral perspective. Even when we think about things that have a genetic basis, right? So let's take a disorder that clearly has a very strong genetic basis, like obsessive compulsive disorder, right? Like we have some ideas of what's going on from a biological perspective. We have good data that it's genetic. What exactly is inherited, we don't know. But the impact of the environment is still there in terms of how that OCD shows up for somebody, whether it's contamination related or symmetry related, or having intrusive religious types of obsessions. I mean, even what influences what people's intrusive thoughts are about are definitely their environment or their culture, their subculture. And I think with paraphilia, it's probably very similar, where people probably learn by chance, meaning that they're in a situation and maybe there's some like have you already seen the term misattribution of arousal?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that probably is something that is playing a big role in any type of paraphilia, is just learning by chance. Like I happen to be doing this thing or watching this particular type of activity, and I had some hyperarousal. I don't just mean sexually. I just mean feeling like hyper alert and really engaged and having a high heart rate. And it's like, oh, I must really like this thing. So it's kind of learning by chance. I think probably behavioral and cognitive theories are going to do a better job explaining paraphilic disorders than other types of theories.
Do you think cases of trauma could also possibly be resulting in this as well?
I don't know. I haven't seen those data. I can see why with the misattribution of arousal kind of tethering that. The thing is that it's a little bit, I would think of misattribution of arousal as coinciding with not potentially traumatic events, because then that's usually the marker. I mean, the hallmark of trauma is avoidance, is not wanting to be anywhere near reminders of what happened, not having any interest in things that might vaguely remind someone of that event. I would think of the type of hyperarousal that goes along with misattribution of arousal is like safe type of arousal. Like there's a difference between being scared in a haunted house where you're definitely not going to be harmed versus getting the same type of like startle response in like a dark alley where you don't know whether or not you're gonna be harmed. Like both are kind of arousal, meaning you have a high heart rate and feeling vigilant, but in one case you're safe and the other potentially not. So I think that I would separate like those two types. I was thinking about how that's kind of safe too, like because they're in jail. So there's a safety in that fantasy. But what I was thinking about is people who like prison guards who run off with criminals. right?
Yeah.
Still a low base rate, and that's real, right? That's like not particularly safe. But I don't know that with them there's a pattern. So that you're kind of same but different in some ways. Whereas people who tend to write, letters to prisoners and express love for people who have committed crimes, it's typically the history of doing that in the first place. So it almost is like a safe fantasy. Where I'd be curious about what happened when they were confronted with possibly being able to be united with this person. I'm sure there's some sort of anecdotal case studies about that.
Now, most humans experience arousal, so why is it mainly affecting women? Well, while it's true that hybristophilia mainly affects women, men can also share this disorder. But there's a combination of many factors that make it more female. The evolutionary psychology and our little dumb caveman brains could be at hand. A big, strong, hypermasculine man protects and makes a good, strong baby, right? Well, it's not really evolutionary advantageous to be with someone that could kill you.
Males who commit crimes and have these types of track records maybe are seen as being hyper masculine, and that might be appealing to people. I don't know how evolutionary psychology would explain males who are attracted to female criminals. That would be, I'm guessing it's a lower base rate too, just in terms of criminality. But I think in one direction, you could probably argue that it's, a caricature of what maleness means and masculinity means. But what would argue against that is that it's not evolutionarily advantageous to associate yourself with someone who could kill you. Right. So it's that's why I think, I guess you could say one thing, but I would counter with, that they could kill you.
However, there's also evidence proving that the human brain is weird, and sometimes we do things that aren't the best for our survival. Such as fainting when we see blood. That's not the best for our bodies. Granted, the thing about the human brain is it's a little weird, and so sometimes it does things that don't make evolutionary sense. And being attracted to serial killers just may be one of them. No, it's actually more likely to be due to societal conditions. I was able to gain a better understanding of this through my interview with Professor of Media Studies, Charlie Dana. Well, first off, there just aren't as many female serial killers. Men make up the majority of them, and most women serial killers, statistically speaking, don't get caught as often. And when there are female serial killers, they aren't portrayed the same way media has been. Male murderers are portrayed and cast as these generally classically attractive actors, and their backstories are seen as more empathetic and just as fuel.
He was a father, a husband, and a kind member of the community, unfortunately saddled with a tragic past.
The abuse he faced can only be assumed to be the cause of this gentle giant's heinous action.
Whereas women aren't depicted in as much as a physically attractive light, and they don't get these more dramatic, empathetic backstories. No, they're portrayed as these psychodeviants.
A psychodeviant.
Who suddenly snap.
She suddenly snapped.
Or they're the poor, helpless accomplices who are just going on with whatever the big, strong man killer wanted. That's not as charming, is it?
Yeah, gender's where my research is, so I can speak to that more broadly. What I have found is that contemporary true crime that features accused women actually doesn't follow sort of the injustice narrative trend that we've seen. There are three things that it pathologizes women, so saying their crime is a result of insanity, which is a common trope we've seen applied to any sort of female person who doesn't adhere to dominant gender norms. The second trope is framing accused women as accomplices, so they didn't actually have agency over this crime. They were influenced by some typically male bad actor, so it's their partner. Or a great example of this is there was a woman who was a prison guard who helped two folks escape, and the narrative around that was really predominantly that she was swindled by these two guys who were the actual bad actors. They're just evil. So they're stripping their humanity and just seeing. So if of Eileen Warren's,
the America's first female serial killer.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what she's labeled as. There's that's not accurate, but that's a whole other thing. But right, so, and she's seen as one, sexually perverse or deviant in her lesbianism and in her work, sex work. And then two, and consequently stripped of her femininity and labeled as this degendered, dehumanized, just evil. You know what I mean?
And we continue to see in media that the stereotype of the helpless woman and the strong man, especially with this victim killer kind of archetype, keeps getting perpetuated. which in a way is just perpetuating the harmful stereotypes about women and reinforces those wonderful patriarchal power structures. Furthermore, and more interestingly, I was able to learn that true crime media has always been marketed towards women more. In the age of the housewives in the 1940s and 1950s, radio programming was targeted at women.
I think women are more drawn to true crime because that's who it's been geared towards historically. Like even if you look at like radio dramas and things like that were produced for daytime listening, a lot of the crime dramas fell in like, I don't know if you're familiar with these like radio histories, but like crime. So radio became a form of entertainment and really a new one, This was the first time media was in the home. And that corresponded with women primarily being in the home. And so the programming, you can look at like old radio programming, and most of the daytime programming is geared towards women, and the evening program is geared towards like families and men. And by families I mean like kids. And so a lot of these like soaps or like crime dramas aired during the day because they were like marketed towards women.
I didn't actually think about more of the nurture part of why the genre is more oriented at specific individuals than other. Mainly I only heard the nature part of it, that, oh, well, this depicts this type of empathy or something about trauma and sorts. So I think it's interesting looking at it through a standpoint of that of marketing. I hadn't considered that before, that it was oriented towards this demographic.
Yeah, and that's like, it was because women were in the home each day, so you have like serials, like as in episodes that picked up each day in a way that some radio programming didn't. Yeah, but that's all the stuff, like I'm really interested in the history of true crime and how it's evolved to like our gender, how those histories of gender true crime have evolved to impact like current gendered relations in, like in the context of true crime. But yeah, so point being, I don't study the kind of nature at all. I don't study any, but I'm a big post-structuralist. I don't think anything's inherent, like I think everything's a construct. So.
Right.
Even before we do with the movie novels, I suggest you look it up if you don't know what it is yourself, because I'm going to sound stupid. But essentially, they're not, I don't want to say fan fiction, but they're interpretations of the events and crime that was going on at the time. Say Jack the Ripper did this, and someone would write it into a novel that week and describe the events and put in their own flair and characterization. And because of that, there was some weird, like, romance going on and other drama, even though these were real events with real people that were getting killed. And this ended up being marketed once again towards women because they'd add these, like, mysterious, this man, this drama. They would add that in there and it would appeal to the women demographic. And it continued to, and it would not. I think pigeonholed. We're gonna go with pigeonholed. I don't know if that's right, but they got set into this that women love crime, and they just continue to get marketed towards. In these communities, we do see discussions of Hybristophiliacs debating the moral quandary of their attraction. And yes, there's a lot of them that do understand that they want help and that they can't control it, and they aren't condoning the actions of all of the people they're attracted to, and they just can't help who they're attracted to. You can control something like that. But unfortunately, because of that, there's another portion of the community that notices that most. You know who else can't control their attraction? LGBT community. We're essentially them. We're essentially sexuality. And then there's those that don't want to make it a sexuality. There's those that believe that it's just a kink and it should be part of the BDSM community. So what's my take on Hybristophilia? Well, as someone who's always been interested in crime and the darker aspects of human nature, I can understand how someone might be able to empathize or even be attracted to these people. Overall, it's a complex and multifaceted issue that understands an understanding of both human behavior and psychology. However, it is important to acknowledge the harm that can come from romanticizing or glorifying criminal behavior. While I do believe that everyone is entitled to their own opinions and sexual preferences, I do find it concerning that there are some individuals who believe that being attracted to a criminal is a legitimate sexuality. Attraction towards someone who has committed heinous crimes goes beyond sexual orientation and can be dangerous and a harmful mindset to have. It is one thing to be interested in the psychology behind criminal behavior, but it's another thing entirely to completely condone or excuse these violent acts. It's important to remember that criminals are not objects of desire, and their actions have real consequences for the victims and their loved ones. And believe me when I tell you that this is harmful, because I think we often forget when we get so consumed with media that there are real people that were involved in these. They are real people that were hurt, that there are real victims, the families. This happens in real life. It's not fictional, it's not just some random characters. This happens. And it's sad. You see these Hybristophiles that are excusing their behavior, and they're going, oh, but the victims aren't even alive anymore. It's, oh, well, I don't care about the families. They don't want to see what I say, then they should just ignore it. Or say that the victims deserved it in some way. And saying that because the killer was traumatized, it justifies it. And it doesn't. It doesn't. I understand that sympathizing with what they had to go through, especially because with the Hybristophiliacs, there is also a similar trauma. So it is likely that they see some similarity. What? Similarity! When shooting with serial killers and themselves, that just doesn't make it okay. And by making these communities and by talking to each other and building off, it becomes this echo chamber of opinions that just keep getting solidified. And yes, most Hybristophiles are helpers. So the majority of them are passive and are going to die without committing any crimes. But there are a lot that have killed or assisted the killer in committing his acts out of this passion. There's the Kenneverdi killers, Carol Bundy, who assisted in serial killing Nicholas Hart, Christina Viola, this Irresistible, or in the belief that wanted to reclaim the Columbine shooting in Colorado several years ago. There's a lot of examples, and these examples do exist, so we can't just write them off as being completely harmless when evidence shows that having this paraphilia can inherently cause harm. So I appreciate you listening today, and I do intend to remake this video. I want to better script it, better edit it, better film it. There's a lot more I want to add, and a lot more length I want to add to this video. But unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, I'm unable to do that here today. But I hope you still learned something nonetheless, and I also hope, more importantly, that you're able to walk away trying to form your own opinions about this phenomenon. Do you think that it should be considered sexuality, or what are the moral boundaries of this when someone can't control their own attraction? Do you think there should be anything done with the media to portray this? And with the media, do you think they're even to blame? So as this becomes more widespread into the term Hybristophilia or Hybristophiliac, I want you to think about this and think about where you went. Always keep looking. Or something. Insert a tagline here. I don't know.